Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Chikodili Emelumadu, and I'll be chairing this roundtable discussion today. We'll be looking at the impact and the legacy of Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God. I'm seeing as this is 50 years since the book was published. And to my left is Dele Fatunla, who is, I have it here, the communications manager for the Royal African Society. And to my right is Chibundu Onuzo, who is the author of The Spider King's Daughter. Right, I'm going to kick it off with Dele. Tell me who it is that you think in literature Chinua Achebe most resembles.
Okay. So I have to confess that first, speaking to this audience, I'm actually approaching this very much as a reader because I'm not part of the distinguished and esteemed intellectual and academics here, yet anyway. But I really do think, for me, as a reader, the people that most echo for me with Achebe are Toni Morrison and Chimamanda Adichie in terms of their project, because Toni Morrison talks about her work as kind of an act of rememory, and what she calls rememory is, in a way, remembering something which has never, or not forgetting something which has never been remembered. So it's going over historical instances that are perhaps neglected, or experiences of people that are perhaps neglected, and actually bringing that to the fore in very personal and vivid imagination. And I think if you look at the work of Toni Morrison, and I was very glad that Nana Aibia-Clark mentioned that Toni Morrison contributed to the tribute to Chinua Achebe, because in a way, Chinua Achebe precedes both her and Chimamanda Adichie, and a lot of what he was doing with setting Things Fall Apart in the 1890s and Arrow of God in the 1920s is actually giving you a very lived historical experience of what it's like to be in traditional African culture. And even though the differences are not very grand, they are very subtle. They're very different, subtle differences in time between what's happening in, and this is in the traditional setting, not the colonial, in Arrow of God and Things Fall Apart. Yeah.
So would you say, I mean, to an extent, that Chinua Achebe is sort of like the historian of maybe Igbo culture, maybe in a wider sphere, the African traditional culture?
Yes,
I mean, so bold.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, it's quite obviously acknowledged that he is a historian, but I think it's something slightly more profound than just saying that he's a historian. I think what he's actually creating for you is that he's revalorizing particular aspects of culture. I'll give you an example. I think if you read Arrow of God, for me, one of the things that's very striking is the description of the architecture of the village, and the way that it's actually, you can almost feel the tenderness with which he's touching the walls, with which he's describing the way people move around that space. Because I think if you speak to anybody, in a lot of people, at least in places in Nigeria nowadays or the rest of Africa, they might actually look askance at the traditional architecture. And in books like Arrow of God, what you see is somebody actually making you look at that culture on its own terms, but also making you realize that actually that materialness is rich. As I don't quite know how to put this to people to make them understand the depth of feeling with which I see it. Is that it's almost like if you can imagine a father looking at a newborn child. That's kind of what he's making you do with the way you're looking at Igbo culture in his work.
And Chibundu, this one is for you. What would you say for you has been the impact of Arrow of God in particular, but maybe Chinua Achebe's body of work?
Actually, it's funny. I only read Arrow of God for the first time a week and a half ago when I was asked to do this panel. It's the only piece of Achebe. I've confessed to you, everybody stoned me. It's the only Achebe book that I haven't read. And again, for me, when I heard that, I think he described it as his novel that he's most likely to reread, which was kind of like, I guess, his own way of saying it was kind of his favorite book, because he said you can't pick your favorite child. Yeah. But then I was like, how can he diss Things Fall Apart like that? I took it personally. So yeah, I just haven't come along to reading it. And then having read it, I don't know, it was like the missing piece in reading all of Achebe's fiction, and it was, I can see why he would describe it like that. I think Arrow of God, Chinua Achebe as a whole, it's interesting what he did for one generation, which is my parents' generation. And I think my father has the best kind of one-line review of Achebe, and he says, Achebe showed the good in Igbo culture, and he showed the bad. And it was very important for people of a generation who've been always told you're savages, you're lower than white people, to be presented their culture. No, it's not a sentimental look.
It's not over-romanticized.
Yeah, I read, and what I like about Achebe, as opposed to Shoyinka, I know this is not a comparative panel. There's no competition, Nobel versus no Nobel, but I like, there's no romanticism at all, and he shows you aspects of the culture that reading in 21st century, you read and you're like, ah. I think the bit about human sacrifice, I read, in fact, I wrote it down. It says, I'll read it to you. When we want to make a charm, we look for the animal whose blood can match its power. If a chicken cannot do it, we look for a goat or a ram. If that is not sufficient, we send for a bull. But sometimes, even a bull does not suffice. Then we must look for a human. Do you think it is the sound of the death cry gurgling through blood that we want to hear? And I read that in 2014, and I was just like, hey, I'm glad I don't live in that village. But then at the same time, what he did was he brought that this was a rational society. They did not do things, this was their understanding of the world. And there is no judgment of, this was how they understood the world. They didn't do things because they were savages. They didn't do things because they were not capable of compassion. They didn't do things because, this deep, dark place. I think it's that unflinching look at the past, looking at the good, looking at the bad, and saying they were as human, as civilized as anything, as any other culture.
And as a writer, how would you say that this has helped you? Do you think it has had an impact on your writing at all?
I think for me, the Achebe book that has kind of had biggest impact on my writing was probably Things Fall Apart. But I guess this is coming later in my... So I can't say now what impact Arrow of God is going to have.
I think for me, what I found to be interesting was I read Arrow of God a few times as a child, and I've read Things Fall Apart as well. And I'm going to top your story there because I'm a story topper. I reread Arrow of God yesterday, so I spent about 10 hours reading it, and I have a child, so that wasn't easy. And what I found was that I thought I would see something new that I didn't see while I was a child. And I think what Arrow of God, and maybe to a large extent, Things Fall Apart, No Longer at Ease, has made me realize is the ease with which we tell our stories now. And by that I mean it's not difficult for us to go within ourselves as writers and to represent who we are to the world. I think growing up, I took Chinua Achebe for granted a little bit, but that was because I was born in that kind of generation, I think, that would take something like that for granted. My parents, obviously, this was a major breakthrough for them, but for me, I took it for granted because, well, it was there. And also to an extent, because our parents, like you mentioned, our parents, they didn't really, your father said that Achebe showed the good and the bad in Igbo culture. But I think my parents, his stories kind of stood in the stead of what my parents would have talked to us about. So they were from the Biafra generation, and everybody just wanted to sweep everything under the carpet and just move on with it. And they were children of people who had met the white man. So they were like Oduche in that respect. They all wanted to move on with it, go to school, go to university, have a white-collar job, be a doctor, be a nurse, something, be white, basically. And so I think that for me, personally, Achebe not only made it possible for me to see myself in literature, see my culture in literature. I mean, I come from an area called Oba, which is in Idemili local government area, so we still have the whole Python reverence thing. And it made sense to me, I could see my village in Umuaro. It was also that he was some sort of surrogate grandfather in that while our parents were busy getting on with it, we were reading Achebe and discovering for ourselves the world that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers lived in.
I wanted to come in actually on that point again about parents, because I think it was writers like Achebe, and I don't actually know if my dad would say this, but he definitely must have been part of. He empowered them to assert their culture. So, for example, my dad and all his siblings, they all have Christian names, i.e. English names,
Yeah.
Malcolm, Bertram, all sorts, But none of my siblings and none of my cousins have, Christian names. We have Igbo names, we have Yoruba names, depending on where the wives they married came from, but none of us have. And I think it was this idea that if you ask my dad why none of us have English names, he'll tell you he's never seen a white man called Obinna. So why should any of his children have English names? And I think this way of thinking, and in the sense that we took on Christianity, but we're not ashamed of who we are, even despite the fact that because people convert in other places. Conversion doesn't always have to be such a brutal erosion of your culture and your identity. Yeah.
And tell me, Dele, coming back to you now, tell me, do you think that in spite of, I don't know, maybe, I guess what I'm trying to ask you is Chibundu made a point now about Christianity, and how much do you think that Arrow of God or Achebe's body of work, how much do you think that helped your understanding of the way that Christianity came into play?
Okay.
Your appreciation maybe of...
I've had a few things written here which I'm going to read because it's probably easier for me to get those points across. But I actually think that I think Arrow of God is an apologia for Christianity, in the sense that it's what Achebe is essentially doing is he's providing the psychological rationale for how his people came to be a group of people that would actually abandon their gods, with a very traumatic experience. And I guess the underpinning that he puts under it is that it actually comes down to political economy, and the reason that they abandoned their gods is essentially because they were not going to be able to eat if they did not do that. But he also, I think, is providing a psychological platform for people like him, who I consider, I think the whole group of people who became your parents and my parents are sort of Nigerian Creoles. They're not Creoles in this way that, Sierra Leonean Creoles are Creoles, but they're Creoles in kind of their psychological makeup, because you kind of want to valorize your traditional culture, but you're also you need to have a kind of a reconciliation with traditional religion. So what Achebe does in the novel is that he actually makes Ulu, who is the god of his society, sort of melt into the Christian god. And there's a section where he actually does, and I'd just like to read a little bit of that so that you can get the sense. So if I can find it. Okay, there he goes. He goes, if Ulu had spotted the white man as an ally from the very beginning, it would explain many things. It would explain Ezeolu's decision to send Oduche to learn the ways of the white man. It was true Ezeolu had given other explanations for his decision, but those were the thoughts that had come into his head at the time. One half of him was man, and the other half Mo. The half that was painted over with white chalk at important religious ceremonies, and half of the things he ever did were done by this spirit side. So I think that's kind of it, because for me what's very perplexing is that there's a part of, I think a lot of people, if you're not a Christian, as I'm not, and you're kind of an African, Pan-Africanist, rationalist, you think, why don't we just abandon this Christianity and Islam? And you find the evangelism in Africa quite perplexing, because you think it's not working for us on lots of levels. But when you see what Achebe is doing, he's showing you is that this reconciliation happened. So there's a very large group of people, Achebe included, who are actually vested in a rational society which is actually based on Judeo-Christian values, but melded in with traditional African religions. And that's kind of what I think is happening in Arrow of God.
Because you're trying to say you borrow the bits that are, we heard this in the last session, you borrow the bits that work, and you take away the bits that don't work and put them together. Yeah.
But I think it's unconscious. I don't think it's that conscious. I don't think Achebe was necessarily setting out to write a book where, he melds traditional and Christian faith. I don't think it's conscious, But I think what it does is that it kind of gives a lot of people who aren't in the traditional religion anymore a kind of footing to be able to say, well, I can attach to my culture because in a way we're still worshiping the same God. It's just in a very different way.
You wanted to add to this point?
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing you say about melding is interesting. I looked at it from a historical perspective. So obviously there was a time when England or Great Britain was a pagan country. And so I did a little bit of research on how this island was converted. Because when Christianity came to Britain, it didn't come with a lot of force behind it. 40 missionaries were sent, to the island. So what Pope Gregory, who sent these missionaries, advised them to do was to first live among the people, to look at their culture, to look at their festivals, to look at their feasts, and in essence, Christianize. So in the sense that, there are many festivals, Christmas, that, have roots in pagan origins, but the focus of the festivals have, in a way, I suppose, changed.
Co-opted.
And I don't know, because I'm a Christian, so I don't see it as a totally negative thing. People hear a new idea, they hear a new way, and if there's no force behind it, some people, they just, this, for them, this then becomes, this is the truth, they believe this. So the difference, I suppose, when Christianity came to Nigeria was, it came with guns. It came with force, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It came with force behind it. And you can see how with many festivals in traditional culture, you can see how a missionary that was sent with the purpose of seeing these people as also human beings could have preached the gospel in a way that could have melded the two. Again, I wrote down the passage. This is from the festival of the pumpkin leaves. And so this is Ezeulu. This is what he says. Pronounce it for me.
Ezulu.
Ezulu. I'm half Yoruba as well. So this is what, at the festival of the pumpkin leaves, the book says, this is what they pray. I implore, and they're praying to Ulu, I implore you to cleanse my household of all defilement. If I have spoken it with my mouth, or seen it with my mouth, or seen it with my eyes, or if I have heard it with my ears, or stepped on it with my foot, or if it has come through my children, or my friends, or kinfolk, let it follow these leaves. And then, the villagers trample on the leaves, and then, Ezulu says, he has trampled on the sins of Omar until his feet have bled. And, I read that and I thought, these are very Christian images. These are images that, could easily have, when you came to preach the gospel, you could easily have taken stories that people already had to say, and because what was appealing to the first Britons was that, they say, this is universal. We're preaching a religion that is universal. And every society is trying to deal with the existential problem of sin and et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I think, yes, that wasn't done. And I think writers like Achebe, what you were saying about giving people a footing to stand on who converted to this new religion. I mean, my parents, my dad in particular, who's Igbo, he went to church in a time where you weren't allowed to drum in church. You weren't allowed to dance in church. You weren't allowed to, because those were like pagan things you did.
Pagan instruments.
Yeah, if you didn't wear English clothes, you weren't a Christian. And I think to a certain extent, I know a lot of, there's a lot of angst directed at, the new Pentecostalism, et cetera, But I do feel that those churches allowed Africans to take their culture back in the sense that, you went to all these Pentecostal churches and you could go in your native and your damask and dance and have the talking drum, which, is like, obviously it speaks. It does. And now I find when I go to Anglican church in my village now, it's very different from when my dad went to Anglican church when he was younger because, now everybody's dancing in the aisles and, it's, we've brought our culture back
into it.
Yeah.
But I guess some of the things that I think is, to what extent in Achebe's writing, the way he talks about these things, I think that he himself is actually quite a deeply biblical or Christian writer, and there are echoes of that in the writing. And so I think you may be to some extent subverting tradition, actually, Achebe himself, to make it consumable for a society that has already changed. So, because when you read, in a way, maybe, is he writing that with the intent of describing faithfully the traditions that existed, or is he writing it in a way that actually makes it relatable to you?
But I guess the thing is, again, with the thing going back to my dad, is that, he showed the good and he showed the bad. And I feel that someone who was trying to remake tradition would have left things out. So, for example, have you seen Shoyinka's Death and the King's Horseman?
Yep.
And what I find very interesting about that play is that the central theme is the death of an Oba, in which somebody voluntarily gives their life so the king has a horse to ride into the afterlife. And yes, this happened, this is true. There was like voluntary suicide or whatever, the spirits took it, however you want to see it. However, it's not complete. There were also people that involuntarily were forced to give their lives, like the Oba's maids and his household. They were also killed along. And I feel he didn't add this aspect of the tradition, almost in a sense, because there's no how Wole Soyinka would have known about the extra bits of that tradition, but it was almost in order to make a point, he would kind of pair out some bits.
What point do you think?
Well, the point is, I felt it was like, the Western people, they don't understand that this is not a barbaric custom. This is like part of it's. First of all, he's not killed. It's a voluntary act, etc., etc. But I felt that there might have been justification for intervention for those who did not voluntarily want to enter the afterlife with the Oba. But I feel like if it had been an Achebe book, he would have shown you, like, some people went voluntarily and some people didn't, and that was their rationale.
And some people were buried up to their necks.
Well, yeah, and
with roasted
for vultures to peg them, and he does not apologize for that. That was the society, in the same way that there have been many barbaric practices in European society, both pre-Christian and post-Christian. So there's no apology. Like, he's not. I don't even feel as if he's writing back. I just writing back to perceptions. He's just saying this was what it was.
Yeah. And Dele, I want to find out. I just found out recently that Dele also writes. I read his poem in Jalada magazine. Find it. Do you think that Achebe has had any impact on your writing, on the way that you perceive yourself as a writer? I asked Chibundu this, but I forgot to ask it of you.
I also read Arrow of God last year, by the way, but not because, actually it was because of a video thing I watched with Chimamanda talking about it. But it's very strange because I kind of skipped it. I read Things Fall Apart. I read the other
same.
ones. Weird.
And I read the other one.
I did it. I read it all.
Yeah.
I think I should get a prize.
Or maybe I read Arrow of God and I don't remember it, which I think is actually probably.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but you didn't. If you read it, you remember.
But
at the Arrow of God Symposium.
It's over. No, but one of the things I had a problem with kind of our post-colonial writers is this. Sometimes you have this impression that the language is very heavy and turgid and
miserable,
educated.
misery porn.
But like worthy. But actually, when it always surprises me when you go back and read the books later, and especially as an adult, you're very struck. I mean, the word "fucked" comes up in this story.
Yes.
There's a lot of sex in Arrow of God. If you haven't read it, then you should read it for that. But not sex, actually, sensuality, because it's hinted at.
It's different.
But but it's very. And one of the things that because I'm very appreciative of proverbs, and I like the way the way Africans have very proverbial language, and I think we still do it even in contemporary culture. So I think, and the challenge for writers, I think in the contemporary times, is to do it in a way that doesn't make us sound like we're in the 1890s.
Like we're trying to copy you.
And so, for me, it's kind of looking at how Achebe is doing that, but trying to adapt that into when I'm writing. Because I'm actually, at the moment, I'm trying to write a story which is set. It's kind of contemporary times, but the character is an Obatala worshipper, and you want to allude to things, but not. You don't want to be heavy-handed.
Yes.
And I think Achebe gives you that kind of template.
I think that's actually a very interesting point that you make, because I think one thing I try to find a balance to is how to write in Nigerian English, because there's and actually in my first novel I didn't notice I did it until one of my reviewers pointed out in Nigerian, and she said she didn't feel the language was elevated enough for somebody who wants to publish on a global stage. But I said something like, when they reached the gates. And what would you say in English?
When they arrived at the gate.
But reach is
Yeah.
like
When they reach, it's
But
kind of
reach is perfect.
Yeah, but it's a transliteration, isn't
Yeah.
it? You think about it in
When they reach.
when they reach the gate.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there are certain ways I'm trying to think of, for examples, like off the light or something.
Yeah.
Why? That's the problem, you know. Someone says off the light and they say you've misspoken English.
Yeah.
Why? No. But you understand what I'm going to say, my sister, right? It's about communication. It's not a shell. Yeah, exactly. Yes. That is-
exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
But that's kind of the way we speak.
That's-
Like,
yes.
I think
When someone maybe falls down and says sorry,
Yeah.
it's not your fault.
Or they'll say you fell me down.
yes, or dress.
But yeah, I feel like there's a contemporary way that we speak English that is, you know, different. So it's, for me, it's not about writing in proverbs. For me, it's like capturing that way, that
The essence of it.
Yeah, the way we speak English now, which is different grammatically and syntactically from.
But would you say though that Chinua Achebe helped your appreciation of proverbs? Before you read any of his work, did you know any proverbs, for instance?
Yeah, I was actually going to say that anybody who went to school in Nigeria, do you remember this blue book called First Aid in English? Yeah, yes. Oh, wow, it does matter how old you are, I guess. We all use First Aid in English. And there's this silly, like, 5-page section where you have to cram all these proverbs, and you know, you get all these, a cat may look at a king, which I discovered when I came to England. Nobody even uses these things anymore, but you know,
A stitch in time saves nine.
and you know, make hay while the sun shines. I forgot what was hay. I mean, I never seen hay before. And you are learning make hay, but instead of, you know, and then you learn all a toad does not run in the daytime unless something is after it. Why did they not have those pages in First Aid? I mean, you know, they could have done a Nigerian
Because
edition.
it makes sense.
Yeah,
Because
exactly. It makes sense to us, you know. So many, and then we learn the similes as cool as a cucumber. You know, there's no cucumber that is cool in the Nigerian market. They're all hot. The sun has beaten all of them. So, yeah.
So, any last words? Any
Yeah,
other wrap-up points?
actually, because I was okay. Well, anyways, the thing I was going to say is that I loved Achebe's proverbs, and I think the one that struck me the most was, I think Kwajo already said it, which is when suffering knocks on your door, and you say there's no seat left for him, he says not to worry, he has brought his own stool. So, but yeah.
I was actually going to talk about the structure of the novel, which I found quite experimental, in the sense that there's a forward-moving plot, and you're following this priest, but it also kind of meanders, kind of like mimicking that village life of, you know, people visiting, people talking, discussing.
And then following people's points of view onward. So it's not just the one. You have a protagonist, yes, but you follow different people for like a short amount of time.
Yes, I found that very interesting. What you saw it from, you know, Winterbottom's perspective.
And Clark.
And yeah.
And Akokalia to some extent, until who's not ready to hear?
Oh, sorry.
Until he dies.
Spoiler.
Yeah, ruined it.
You shouldn't
Sorry.
have come for the arrow symposium if you
Yeah,
didn't
so
want
I
to
mean,
read the end.
I understand what you mean about the structure, but what I found was that it's not just mimicking village life. It's more about mimicking, I found, the Igbo way of telling stories. I didn't spend a lot of time with my grandma because she was very Catholic and very strict, so we were scared of her. Sorry, grandma. And but I found out that when she was open to telling us stories, the stories, she could tell them over a few nights. So say we were spending a week with her, it was like 1,001 nights, one of those Arabian, you know, the 1,001. So she'd tell the story, and she was always like going in and out of the story, and you had the refrain, you know, Yizameleza, and you sing, and you know. So I found that maybe the story, even though it wasn't it wasn't really like Things Fall Apart, I found that it seemed to follow that meandering structure. It wasn't. They'll probably ask us not to write that way right now. You know, you're supposed to follow one person, exactly, and stick with them, or two people and stick with them. You don't just jump around. So maybe in that regard, he was ahead of his time.
Yeah, and I think what it would be interesting to ask him, if you could, would be because obviously he writes from a white man's perspective, right from Winterbotham and a couple of the other officers. And I know when he was in university, they gave him a book, Joyce Carey, Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
and he felt that this book didn't mirror like his own, experience of being an African, and he felt it was patronizing in many ways. And I wonder what feedback he got from his, English readers who read the book and thought, actually, no, we feel this is a reduction of the colonial officer, and the pacification of the Niger Delta. Is that really how they thought? Is that?
Yeah. But he gets it right, because actually one of the things I liked about the book is the way that he gets class right. Because the character of Clark is so intimidated by Winterbottom
until he
falls ill.
Yeah.
And you just see that, it's this thing of where, I can't remember who says it, but we've studied you, but you've never really known us. Yeah. So his eye on them is very, very.
Huh?
I think it's sort of like you, and then. In comparison, Toni Morrison talks about this whole idea of she talks about African American men writing from or always being conscious of the white gaze. And what I like about this book, particularly Hour of God, is that even though obviously you have this experience of colonialism there, I think whenever you're in the village, you never get this sense of this other world.
Yes.
It's so all-encompassing. This whole
even though he did mention that people between different villages felt that their village was their own little world. Yeah. So if they had to travel 6 miles to Meriden, they'd feel like we're in a totally different. Yes. Yeah.
So I just think that for me, what's interesting is just getting into because I have to say that I think most of us are actually very far from that metaphysical world where people thought in a way that actually they took the fact that this python or this river is a potent force, or that there's a living force to those traditional ideas, whereas now for us they are mythologies and they're myths, but very
at some point,
mythology. In my village, they are still doing massacre. No.
But
she's joking.
Yeah.
I don't know if I am. I mean, people still go to visit Baba.
Well, yes. I think.
But I think what I'm saying is not. It's not priests. Like. I think there are people who believe and there are people who still do. But I'm actually saying, from my perspective and from the perspective of, I think, a lot of urban Africans, that this big psychological trauma happened, and there are actually these groups of people who are
very separate.
Very separate. People who think in a Judeo-Christian world, and people who think very differently, maybe. And then there are people who flow in between.
I don't know. I think most people kind of flow in between. I mean, growing up in Lagos, sometimes you go to a crossroad and you see somebody has left, and all the cars will just be swerving past, because obviously if you drive over it, you take whatever trouble the person has. I mean, some people believe has put in the, and many people believe because, and even if you don't believe, you don't want to take a chance, just
just in case. Yeah, just in case.
Just in case. I don't know. I feel we haven't discarded us as much as as we think. Yeah. I mean, there was one prayer that they prayed where they said something like, anybody who doesn't come here with good intent, let that bad intent follow them. And I thought they're always accusing Pentecostal churches of this type of prayer. My enemies must fall down and die. You see, it started in a traditional. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Back to center. Yeah.
I guess I've always wondered myself to what extent the Igbo culture of doing away with gods who didn't favor you, what part that played in how easily they were overtaken by Christianity.
But were they overtaken? Because I think maybe that's a little bit of what I was trying to say, which is that he's giving you this point that actually we did what is precisely in our tradition, which is
replace an old god that doesn't work for a new one.
God. Yeah. I think that's what, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, so our discussion has ended, but if you have any questions or comments, would like to hear them. But can you please tell me if it's a question or a comment, and if you're asking a question, can you keep it to one? So don't go on a long thing and expect either of them to remember what you said. Just one question, please. Thank you.
Just some thoughts on the... it's a comment, actually, a very quick comment.
Thank you.
I thought there's a book by Donatus Mwoga, the critic. It's called, some book, I think published 84, called The Supreme God in Igbo Thought, or something thereabout. where the issue, I think the Reverend raised it in the morning about when he referred to Catherine Achalono on the issue of the provisionality, really, of the relationship between the Igbo and their gods. If the god doesn't do something, then you create a new god.
Yes, it's way down, Carlos says.
Exactly.
According to Fino.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I think, but again, it's provisional. Because let's not forget that that's why Achebe himself was saying that in terms of Igbo thought, the concept of the God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit will be quite a problem. It will be problematic. Because it defies the concept of that duality which had been dealt with throughout the seminar, throughout the symposium, that where one thing starts, another starts. So that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost were actually the alien, even in terms of that Igbo thought system.
You like to?
I think there's a bit in the book where they say something about Chukwu, who holds the something of the world. I'm going to search my book.
Maybe leave it and just say what you were going to say.
Okay, fine. From my, I guess from what my parents told me, there was an idea of, Chukwu, who was kind of
all powerful.
Yes. But then, in your day-to-day affairs, you went through your ancestors, or you went through,
or your own personal god,
or that was what I was taught, but I haven't really investigated it further.
Would you be willing to?
Yeah, next time I go to the village.
Which is?
Ubulu.
Okay, well, let us know. Any other questions?
So can I make a quick interjection? Last year, Prof, at our conference, was it last year?
This year?
No, it was last year. Oyekachi brought this contentious issue about China Eke. So the given opinion is that it's God who creates, as God the creator. But he was making the argument that it's actually a duality, Chi and Eke, being opposing, basically like God and the devil kind of thing. So he was trying to make that argument, and people were kind of shooting him down. So it might be.
I'll shoot him down right now.
In fact, that argument is actually also Achebe acknowledges that.
Yes.
Achebe would agree with Onyekachi.
Yes.
And also, Morga would agree.
Yes.
Achebe in fact argues, I think it's the modern not yet on Creation Day.
Yes.
Achebe argues that this was an attempt by the Christians during this conquest period to actually change the syntax of the concept of Chineke, okay, to have this notion of a creator, rather than Chi na Eke. 3 words, not inclusive. Chi na Eke are 3 different things, not Chineke. So it's the Christians, and I think you do see this elsewhere. I think the point about trying to incorporate certain local traditions within the context of either spreading a particular kind of religion was not new in the African scene. The only difference though, on the African scene was the question of conquest was going on simultaneously.
Hello, hi. Just a comment more than anything. I think there's a phrase in several of Achebe's books. I think one of the Education for British Protected Child or something, where he tries to I think his father tries to convert his uncle, and he goes and his uncle points to all his charms and Onuzo titles and says, well, what will I do with these? And I think that phrase is kind of pertinent to what you've been discussing, here, because that question is a question that is beyond answer. What do we actually do with it? What do we do with our history, with our forefathers are not all burning in hell, because that would be the logic by Christianity or by Islam. But they're obviously somewhere. So what do we do with them? And that question is being kind of answered. We've reincorporated them. We've brought them back into the church through, the Pentecostal, the dancing, the drumming. Even if you go to a Mountain of Fire church, it's like which, sorry.